This episode is brought to you by Tegas, the only investment research platform built for the investor. With traditional research vendors, the diligence process is slow, fragmented, and expensive. That leaves investors competing on how well they aggregate data, not on their unique ability to analyze insights and make great investment decisions. Tegas offers an end-to-end platform with all the data you need to get up to speed on a company or on a market, with up-to-date financials, customizable models, management and culture checks, and of course, a vast and growing library of expert call transcripts. Tegas is changing the world of expert research and the investment process. Learn more and get your free trial at tegas.com/Patrick. Today's episode is sponsored by Public.com. That's where you can earn a 5.1% annual percentage yield with a high yield cash account. And while we can't say for certain that's the highest interest rate out there, we can say that at the time of this recording, that's higher than Robinhood, higher than SoFi, Marcus, Wealthfront, higher rate than Betterment, Capital One, Ally, Barclays, a way higher rate than Bank of America and Chase, higher rate than Citi, Wells Fargo. I think you get the point here. If you want to start earning 5.1% APY on your cash, check out Public.com. This is a paid endorsement for public investing, 5.1% APY as of March 26, 2024, and is subject to change. Full disclosures and terms and conditions can be found in the podcast description. U.S. members only.
This is Business Breakdowns. Business Breakdowns is a series of conversations with investors and operators diving deep into a single business. For each business, we explore its history, its business model, its competitive advantages, and what makes it tick. We believe every business has lessons and secrets that investors and operators can learn from, and we are here to bring them to you. To find more episodes of Breakdowns, check out joincolossus.com.
All opinions expressed by hosts and podcast guests are solely their own opinions. Hosts, podcast guests, their employers, or affiliates may maintain positions in the securities discussed in this podcast. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions.
This is Matt Reustle, and we are back in the world of aviation today, breaking down Embraer. Now, commercial aviation is one of the most famous duopolies in the world. You have Boeing and Airbus that dominate all of the headlines and those large commercial jet orders. Yet, Embraer has carved out this interesting niche, manufacturing regional jets, business jets, and military aircrafts. In comparison, Embraer has about a $5 billion market cap and did about $5 billion in sales last year as of the time of this recording in the spring of 2024. And that's about a tenth of the size of Boeing and Airbus on both of those metrics, respectively. Our guest today is Richard Aboulafia, Managing Director at AeroDynamic Advisory and longtime aviation analyst and consultant. And we want to give a special shout out to the Odd Lots podcast. We heard Richard tease the intrigue of Embraer on a recent episode, and naturally, we needed to learn more. So we break down how this aviation success story grew out of Brazil. We talk about the evolution of the regional jet market, the business jet market, tap a little bit into military aircrafts. And of course, we cover the opportunity presented by Boeing today. As Richard puts it so well, it would take a bet the company type approach if they were to really go after Boeing's market position. And whether or not that's realistic, I really like the framing and it's a fun thing to think about. So please enjoy this breakdown of Embraer. All right, Richard, I'm excited to talk Embraer today. In the world of aviation and aircraft manufacturers, it's often categorized as this duopoly with Boeing and Airbus, but there is space for others, clearly. And I thought we could just start there with how Embraer fits into the ecosystem.
Yeah, Embraer is a fascinating story, and we can talk about its origins and what that all means. But in terms of the here and now, it's a deeply respected niche player in three different areas. One is business jets, the other is military, and finally, commercial, where it had regional jet origins, actually regional prop origins, and then regional jet origins, and then came up with its current family of E2 series, which almost get into the bottom end of Airbus and Boeing territory, but not quite. They're great products. they're certainly relevant for the markets they address. But in terms of challenging Airbus and Boeing, they're just not quite there in terms of range and capacity.
You mentioned their interesting origins. It's businesses based in Brazil, came from Latin America. I typically think of the commodities industries where they have mining operations. You have a lot of oil and gas businesses come out of that region, certainly banking sector to support economies, but not too many manufacturing businesses like this. So maybe you can bring us back to the start and what created or what was the idea behind launching a business like Embraer?
If I could come up with one phrase that describes the origins of Embraer and its implications and meaning for the future, it would be, don't try this at home. This very strange story, not to belittle it, but it was kind of a fascist Hunter hobby shop back in the late 60s. One popular theme in Latin American economics and politics back in the 60s and 70s was autarky, the idea that they should cultivate homegrown industries that would allow them to effectively sustain themselves and generate economic growth. 99.9% of this failed miserably. Embraer, however, worked out pretty darn well. It began as a way to build military systems and some very basic small transports, the kind of thing an emerging nation might need circa 70 or 80 years ago, whenever it was. And, well, it evolved, it worked out. And back when things were getting really good in the 90s, they made the incredibly smart move of privatizing. And that brought them discipline, that brought them great management. But two things about it. Again, don't try this at home, because every other cockamamie autarky scheme in the region pretty much failed, with a couple of other exceptions, but 99% failed. And more relevantly, globally, this idea failed. The idea that, hey, kids, let's build a factory in the jungle and build aircraft. There were a lot of new market entrants. Even next door in Argentina, there was an effort. Chile, most spectacularly, Indonesia had IPTN. And all of them either failed outright, nobly sometimes as cash-sucking corrupt parasites on society. Embraer is the only company, and Brazil is the only country, to successfully enter this business over, well, pretty much since 1960s. It's an incredible story, but again, don't draw larger lessons from this because, frankly, everyone else who tried it failed miserably.
The outliers are always dangerous to pull lessons from. I was wondering, was there a key individual or personality behind these efforts that really led to that success? Any key players in the history?
Obviously, my memory is a bit more recent. I joined the industry in the late 80s. Maurizio Botelho, I believe, was a very key player. He was the last to enjoy the lavish resources associated with the government-owned operation, but he also began to recognize that, hey, the winds of privatization are coming, and it's probably for the best. So he was a key player. Fred Corrado, I believe, was, if not his immediate successor, but right after that. But he really did fantastic things for the company, especially back late 90s, early 2000s, introduced the current 190, 195 series. And I believe he also played a role in diversification because the business jet part of the company was relatively late. They didn't do that till the 2000s. Before that, it was military and commercial, but not BizAv. So that was a key move because that tends to be a more lucrative segment of the world aviation industry.
When I think about that era, you've mentioned where their origin story was, the uprise of some more regional-based airlines.
Yeah, that's right. Their break into the U.S. market was with the EMB-120, the Brasilia, I believe, in the 1980s. And at the time, post-deregulation, a lot of regional passenger operations were growing to feed hubs for the large legacy airlines. As a 30-seater, the 120 was cheap and cheerful, and lots of people adopted it. So that was their entry into the North American market. It allowed them to grow their product support infrastructure and, of course, sales infrastructure. And it made them realize that their past, again, Brazilian hobby shop for local needs, was not their future. Their future was an export business. It also established one of the most important principles of Embraer's evolution, which is the Dell computer model, that really they don't want to do everything. They don't want to be vertically integrated. They don't want people to transfer technology. They simply want their engineers to go shopping for the best systems, best value for money as a principle. And you contrast that with China, it's the exact opposite. People ask, will China be the next Embraer? The answer is, oh, hell no, they're doing it all wrong. Basically, Embraer said, we want to integrate your systems. We don't want the technology. We simply want to provide best value. So it was that period then that they established that as their operating principle.
How does that compare to a Boeing or Airbus, just in terms of the integration side of things?
Pretty much the same. It's just that a lot of people who want to do it on their own, be it Indonesia or whoever else, India, China most notably, have this notion that, well, we need to be truly autarkic. We need to create it in-country engines, in-country avionics. The way to do it is Airbus and Boeing and also Embraer. You integrate other people's systems and you don't demand technology transfer because that leads people to bring you their latest and best from 20 years ago. They're not going to trust you. So Airbus and Boeing are that standard. Embraer tends to be a bit more pro-outsourcing, although, of course, these are cycles that Airbus and Boeing go through.
The regional jet market, comparing that to when I think of the larger aircrafts that Boeing and Airbus tend to dominate, can you just paint a little bit of a picture in terms of maybe popular flights? Obviously, something like New York to Boston, I would assume, is on a regional jet. How far does that span out? And then how would you just classify those two markets next to one another?
New York to Boston is a trunk route. It's going to be thick. It's going to have bigger jets on it. Really, what we're talking is, say, Burlington to New York, secondary cities feeding into the primary hubs. It's funny, back when there were 6 or more large legacy airlines, as you can imagine, this was huge business. In the 90s, the idea of a regional jet, oh my goodness, if you could imagine regional service with a jet. Before that, it was all props pretty much, with a few small exceptions. But Embraer, along with their arch nemesis Bombardier at the time, got there first with a regional jet, which effectively used the tube of the 120 with new wings, new engines, whatever else, new cockpit, and created the 145 series. And this was huge. This was their real breakthrough. It was that combination of being in the right place at the right time with the 145, coupled with privatization, they took place simultaneously, that allowed Embraer to be the great company it is today. But anyway, adding regional jets to the mix allowed people to go further. So it wasn't just, say, Burlington to New York. It would be Dayton or further out, 800, 900, 1,000 nautical miles. So thinner routes that allowed you to feed into a hub. And of course, from the standpoint of airline operations, it's hugely important. You're not going to fly people to Paris from Wichita. Probably not. So you're going to want to bring them to, say, Chicago or Washington or whatever, and then fly them. So you need this big hub and spoke operation to feed your primary hubs.
And how has the consolidation of the airline industry, we can focus on the US, had an impact on the regional market and maybe relative to the longer range market?
It's been really damaging. That's an important question because, of course, you've gone to 3 majors, 4 if you count Southwest, but they don't really have that hub and spoke operation, so they don't use regionals. A lot of those hubs were deemed superfluous. You look back 20 years, Pittsburgh, Charlotte, why not? These are major hubs. Well, no longer, sadly. St. Louis, once the hub for TWA, my goodness. And TWA had regional feeders. The joke at the time was, how many airlines will there be in the year 2025? There'll be 3, 2 globally merged mega carriers and financially troubled TWA. Somehow they eventually died. All of this was devastating for regional aircraft producers. There used to be about 10 of them. And now there is, let me think, 1. I should say 2, because ATR still builds regional turboprops, which no one uses in North America. But the only regional jet producer is Embraer.
And it's surprising to me in some sense where, as civilization moves forward, you would think that something like this, you would have more opportunities, more access. So it just, from your point of view, obviously the airlines had all types of issues in terms of balance sheets and unions and competition. But it does just run counter to what I would think is common sense would say that we'd continue to have more opportunities. So when you think about the outlook for regional in the future, do you have any sense that there will be a rebound, a recovery, a rebirth of more of these hubs?
Not the hubs, but the fleets. There's a greater focus on point-to-point travel. In other words, people don't like being boxed up and shunted through Charles de Gaulle or JFK or Narita. They really don't like it at all. They'd rather fly direct, say from Boston to Dublin, whatever. So you're getting more cities with international service. You're getting more direct. You're getting a lot more of the Southwest effect. Suburban airlines. Southwest doesn't use regionals. Neither does JetBlue. A lot of the new folks in town, recently Allegiant and Frontier, and now more recently Breeze or what have you, they just do point-to-point between secondary cities, Dubuque to Las Vegas. So there's less need for regionals. However, there's this big mystery. There are thousands of 50-seat planes still flying. Embraer has long since ceased production of the 145. Pretty much everyone has ceased production of 50-seat aircraft, almost everyone. What replaces them? And the default answer is you bump up to Embraer's smallest aircraft, which is the E175, 75 seats or so. And they're starting to do pretty well with that. It's not an ideal solution, but it's the only game in town.
When you say it's not an ideal solution, I assume it's because the 50-seat planes are made for aircrafts that are lucky to get 50 people on them for those flights. Is that basically categorize it?
Yeah, that's right. People do like frequency and regional operations. Having said that, there's a seat mile cost reduction the more you go up. And that's always been the problem with regional aircraft. Now, Embraer saw all of this coming. They've got really good planning capabilities. And that's why they diversified. The 175 is a true regional. The 190, 195 really are not. No one's going to use it to feed a hub. They're meant to be point-to-point aircraft. The problem is it's also neither here nor there. It's not a regional, but it's not really a true major. It's doing well enough. You're talking 30, 40 planes a year. So that raises the question of what they do next. Of course, part of the diversification strategy was also business jets, and that's done very well for them. But from their regional origins, they've done a really good job of expanding out.
In those early days, you mentioned it was a breakthrough to be able to fly on a jet to do one of those shorter routes or less dense routes. I'm just curious, when it comes to the players like Boeing and Airbus, was that just not an attractive opportunity? Was it actually a technological breakthrough for Embraer, or was it something that the larger players were maybe just ignoring because of the profit opportunity?
Yeah, for Airbus and Boeing, these were margin destroyers. The regional jet marketplace was regarded as this, how to put it gently, just distorted fantasy land of Alice in Wonderland economics, where you had companies willing to lose money on each plane they sold, but make up for it somehow in volume. So you had companies like British Aerospace or Saab or Fokker or whoever else just losing their absolute shirts on these programs. And of course, Airbus and Boeing were standing by, watching, giggling. Embraer made a go of it because they transitioned away from it and because they were a low-cost operation back in a time when companies like, say, Saab or British Aerospace were high cost. But again, to reiterate, regionals have historically been the land of value destruction.
And I want to pull in some of the other business segments as well. On the defense and military side of things, how big of a percentage or just how important and relevant is that to the Embraer business today?
Yeah, it's pretty important. It depends how you measure it, but typically 20, 30% roughly goes back and forth depending on the years and the programs. But what amazes you is just how ridiculously, absurdly efficient they are. There's the stuff they get to do as part of Hello, we're Brazil's national defense champion. Brazil's buying Gripen fighters from Sweden. We get to co-produce them in country. Hooray. That's not really what they do best. They just have to do it, or they just want to do it, whatever. But for example, they produced a series of maritime patrol and airborne early warning special missions surveillance aircraft using the 145 and even the 120 at some point. These were really good. These were very impressive. And then most amazingly, there's the KC-390 story. This is a tactical military transport developed in conjunction with the Brazilian Air Force. No one can quite figure out how they did this. I mean, It is an amazing achievement for both the development cost and for the unit price. It's got a wing box that's similar to a 767 wide body, really good for tactical military operations. And the only bad thing I can say about it is that it doesn't have the U.S. military stamp of approval. They're working on that. If it did, this would be a killer product. As it is, it's a good product that's finding a niche in the world. But the fact that they did this is just a testament to really amazing and really efficient engineering, given the cost constraints.
Is there something that continues to drive that? Again, it's such a standout in a country that is certainly a economy that's often associated with the largest emerging market players, but I wouldn't say that they're necessarily categorized or stereotyped in this way of having this engineering prowess, manufacturing prowess, anything along those lines. So is there something that continues to drive that cost and technological advanced?
It's two things. One is they've always been good at a vertical integration with engineering education. You look at operations like ITA, I forget the acronym, but basically they were created in parallel with an engineering academy down in Brazil, really good at producing skilled talent. So they basically become a talent farm, if you will. But the other factor, frankly, is that corporate culture. It's been engineering driven, engineering focused, very aware of cost constraints. You look at what's going on with Boeing right now, the decapitation that very badly needed to take place this week and did, I'm happy to say. It was the exact opposite. It was run by people who were excellent at Microsoft Excel with some skills at Microsoft PowerPoint and very little knowledge of engineering or aircraft design and manufacturing. Embraer is the exact opposite. It's really been good at retaining that aircraft-focused engineering and design culture.
Yeah, it's fascinating to learn about. On the military and defense side, again, you mentioned it doesn't have the U.S. stamp of approval. I wonder about that business, how much of what they're building is being exported to other nations? And it seems like it would be a very unique business line if you're building something that could be used eventually against you, potentially. So how does that trend over time? And is there anything unique about managing that business segment that you would point to?
Well, just that shift away from domestic requirements to global opportunities. You look at its start, they were building very light planes, liaison planes like the Xingu Embraer 110, and then the Tucano, which was a very light trainer for the Brazilian market. But they began to get some nice export orders. And then they developed the Super Tucano, otherwise known as the ALX. And the ratio for that, export versus domestic, has been roughly 2-1 in favor of exports. KC-390, they've started to get some export traction. So far, it's roughly 1-1 domestic exports. So they become far more export-oriented, with the big caveat that their U.S. market breakthroughs have been pretty limited so far. Just some props sold for U.S. Special Forces, a few other things. But in general, their mindset is a lot more global than it used to be.
Is there an opportunity with what's happening with Boeing for Embraer to fill in that gap a bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. They're not going to be building the Air Force's next generation superfighter anytime soon. But most promisingly, they have allied with, I guess, what you might call a couple of U.S. second-tier defense primes, Sierra Nevada, respected company, L3 Harris, respected company, on marketing into the U.S. Again, breakthroughs have been pretty darn limited, partly because of the nature of what Embraer produces. It's not really what you call perfect for a superpower, but it's really good for second-tier countries. Could they get a breakthrough with the KC-390? That's something that I'm sure Lockheed Martin is watching very closely. They build the C-130 Hercules transport, which is a pretty direct competitor, and that's continued to keep the entirety of the U.S. military transport franchise. But this is something that people have to watch if they're in the business of being a U.S. military prime.
And I would say I would put the BizJet business in a different category, but for the commercial side of the business and the defense and military side of the business, when it comes to customers and their interest in diversifying fleets, does that play a role in terms of giving them an opportunity, or is there more desire to concentrate in a certain aircraft type? Can you just talk about the benefits or negatives that would be associated with customer fleets and how they manage them?
Yeah, it's a completely different business with completely different customers. Every so often, you'll get an airline talking about operating a business jet unit, and it began with Pan Am and Dassault Falcon Jet. It didn't work out. Around 20 years ago, you had United with its operation called Avalar. It didn't work out. You're getting people talking about it now. It's not going to work out. Business jets go to high net worth individuals, corporations, and fractional and charter providers who are generally not affiliated with airlines. It's just a completely different customer base, completely different set of operating specs. So this was a real, I don't want to say gamble, but it was a really, shall we say, different move when they went into the space. It was, okay, this is out of our comfort zone. We're going to meet some new people. We're going to do some new things with completely new airframes. This is about 20 years ago. And they created the Phenom 100 and 300. Later, the Legacy 450, 500, now the Praetor. I don't know why they renamed it the Praetor, but they renamed it the Praetor. They based the business in Florida. A lot of the manufacturing isn't in Brazil. It's in Florida. And they've done incredibly well. A kind of arbitrage. They basically said regional jet margins suck. Business jet margins, they're pretty darn good. What if we accept better margins than regionals, but not as good as what, say, Gulfstream or Cessna are getting? And sure enough, that worked brilliantly. For example, the Phenom 300, which sells for roughly 12 million or so, has become the product of reference for a lot of fractional charter providers. They've been building about 5 per month of those things. That's a really good business.
And you mentioned that customer is completely different. Do you have a separate sales team that are interacting? Like, is there a brokerage that really controls a lot of this?
You go to events like National Business Aircraft Association convention, either in Vegas or Orlando, depending on the year. You see how hand-to-hand it is. A lot of it comes down to, it's like, Mark Wahlberg, what can I do to get you in, etc. It's not the same as talking with people looking at spreadsheets in airline fleet departments. It's not that at all. It's not economics. A lot of it is sentiment-based. A lot of it is the rich Corinthian leather coupled with our gorgeous executive dining option facilities on this jet are just going to be so much better. And I know you're probably not dumb enough to believe that because all business jet primes are pretty darn nice. But come on, we golf together. We're friends. Don't you like our jet? It's just a completely different set of selling stuff.
Yeah, I can only imagine. It's a fascinating addition to other businesses, which seem very traditional in terms of the sales cycle and what would go into them. Going back to commercial, I think of this as a backlog type business where you have orders, you place those orders in. What does the typical cycle look like just in terms of when they're announcing that there's an order book, when those actually come into service or when they recognize the revenues? And then we'll get into the life cycle of the planes as well.
Typically, to build a jet takes a year, depending on the jet. Wide body is longer, but they don't build wide bodies. However, the one funny thing about this business is that orders are placed many years out, depending upon airline requirements. The old joke is if an airline makes money, it orders planes. If it keeps making money, it takes delivery of those planes. There isn't always a connection here. You could see an order appear and it won't be delivered till 2028. In the case of some Airbus jets that are hugely popular, 2030s aren't uncommon. But in terms of manufacturing time, about a year. In terms of payments, your revenue question, typically there's some tiny amount up front. It could be 1 grickle, it could be 1% or 2%. Then you make progress payments as manufacturing begins. And then at handover, typically it's about 50%, roughly. So delivery is a big event from a revenue standpoint, but there are milestones on the way that do give you money.
And when I see the list price for some of these new planes, I know that's not what is being paid. Is there a rule of thumb in terms of what discount airlines might get relative to list price?
Yeah, on the business jet front, list prices are pretty normal. As a matter of fact, they're typically inflated by options, rust proofing and air hockey table and whatever else. But jetliners, list price is a great work of fiction. Typically, you get 50% off for showing up and wearing a tie. Obviously, a lot depends on the equipment, the timing, the circumstances. And this represents one of Embraer's few vulnerabilities. Years ago, they were going head-to-head with Bombardier on what was the Bombardier C series against the 195, 190, 195. And Bombardier had exactly the same cost base that Embraer did. They were both niche players. The C series was given away to Airbus, where it became the A220. And Airbus has enormous supply chain muscle, so they've been able to get costs down. They're continuing to drive costs down, and Embraer is having a hard time competing with that. And that factor was a key driver behind the abortive tie-up with Boeing back, I believe, about 4 years ago.
Interesting. From a cost perspective, one thing that jumps out to me is Brazil, you do have a lot of volatility in the currency that can take place. Is there anything that they do to manage the FX exposure that they have? Obvious question, I guess.
To a very great extent, jetliners organically hedged. I think it was the economist Jeffrey Sachs who made the point that Embraer is Brazil's largest exporter, one of the largest exporters. It's also one of their largest importers. So you think maybe 70, 80% of the value of a jet is imported. There's your organic hedge. Currency fluctuations also help you or hurt you depending upon which end of the transaction. They have gotten over the years a little bit of assistance from export credit agencies in Brazil. ProEx, I believe, is the name of their XM. That helps a bit. And of course, whatever hedging they might engage in as a company, although I can't imagine very much because of that organic hedging factor.
Yeah, that's a good point I had not considered at all, but it makes total sense. On the defense side of the business, is there anything unique about how those orders come in and backlog built up and actually seeing them come into service, particularly when you would compare it to the commercial side of the business?
Obviously, it tends to be a bit more geopolitical. And this is another, hesitate to call it a weakness, but Brazil is not the US. It's not even France or the UK or a country that you might want a strategic relationship with. There's no Brazilian aircraft carrier that's going to be riding to your rescue in the event of conflict. But nevertheless, you do have Brazilian statesmen out there. I remember living in Britain during the Falklands War, and one popular rumor in Britain, which could be true for all I know, was that the big breakthrough order of Tucano trainers to the Royal Air Force in the 1980s was as a thank you for Brazil massing forces on the Argentinian border. I can't verify that. And again, it's 40 years old, for God's sake, but it was a fascinating rumor at the time. But yeah, geopolitics just plays a much bigger role in these sorts of transactions.
Would not surprise me in the least. Way more crazy things have happened, and we see all types of favors returned in a variety of ways. So quite interesting there.
And of course, the final proof that it's a conspiracy, the conspirators were so good, they left us exactly zero proof of what they had done.
Precisely. Yes. Not in this day and age. There'd be a way to track that for sure. When I think about the monetization of this business, you have the sale of the plane. Is there any revenue that's coming from services or parts and repair after the sale of the plane? And if so, how much of the business is driven by that?
Yeah, typically, if you look at the life of an aircraft, say on average 25 years or so, the aftermarket revenue is somewhere around 125% of the sales price over that period of time, which is significant, but of course far less lumpy than the big cash payment you get from delivering the damn thing. Having said that, a lot of it goes to the subsystem providers. Nothing Embraer does moves. They don't make brake pads. They don't make turbine fan blades. So a lot of that aftermarket revenue goes on to the people who do make those things.
And when I think about the replacement, you mentioned 25 years. I would imagine there's some things that can either pull that forward or push that back, mainly oil prices, if you see major spikes and you have inefficient fuel planes. But are there other drivers of that when it comes to whether it's technology in a certain type of aircraft or anything else that has an impact on the replacement cycle?
Oh, absolutely. It's a key thing to look at. It's fascinating. One of my favorite charts is the ratio between fuel prices and interest rates from the standpoint of selling new aircraft and getting older ones out of the mix. You want a world where basically cash is free, because most jetliner transactions are, in fact, third-party financed, and where fuel is quite expensive. So you have an incentive to bring on new, more fuel-efficient equipment. But are there other factors? Absolutely. Technology, but with the caveat that this is not a disruption-prone business. Most technology improvements are incremental. Another factor, of course, is simply demand relative to supply. Right now, we're in this fascinating dynamic where the industry is badly supply constrained, particularly at Boeing. Demand is high, so you're getting a lot of stuff hauled out of the desert, refurbed, and that's why you find yourself in the back of a 757 that looks like it's got cigar burns on it or something. That's supply and demand, pure and simple.
I was going to ask, when you mentioned supply constraint, my assumption was that there were a lot of aircrafts that were out of service from the airline consolidation. Obviously, COVID played some role in some of this. But when you think about not just new supply coming into the market, but maybe those parked aircrafts, is there still a substantial amount of those available to the extent they're needed to come back into fleets?
Oh, hell no. This is a really tight market. We tend to look at parked aircraft under, I guess, two headings. One is relevant and the other irrelevant. There's a lot of stuff that's permafrost. That's not coming back. That's a beer can waiting to happen. And then you've got the stuff that's maybe it's undergoing a D check. Maybe some airline went bankrupt and they're waiting to repo it. But normally that part of it, the relevant part, fluctuates with supply and demand. We've had many supply and demand cycles since the great airline mergers. So that problem has all been taken care of. COVID, oh God, that was fascinating. The number of parked aircraft was nothing like we'd ever seen before, but they're gone. This is a really tight market.
When you mentioned before that some of Embraer's bigger planes don't quite compete with Boeing and Airbus, but they're starting to have some overlap. When you think about the strategy from here, is that something that you think they would continue to try to inch up in terms of size? Do they seem quite comfortable in the segment that they're in? Just trying to predict their aspirations to the extent possible. Where do you think they go from here? And does the Boeing issues present an opportunity to do that?
This is the biggest question in the industry for many. First of all, they've done everything they can to their existing product. Back about a decade ago or so, they redid the 190, 195 as the 190, 195 E2 with new engines and pretty much new wings too. So that tube is at everything, two class, 120 something seats, a couple thousand nautical miles. That's it. And they're great for that mission, for that role. They're terrific, but that's really not Airbus and Boeing territory. Okay. To do something new in Airbus and Boeing territory, that would be a bet the company moment. And given Boeing stumbles, I'm sure there are people considering this. And that is fascinating because, again, until Boeing gets new management, Embraer is the exact opposite of Boeing. They're really good, pure and simple. However, unless they ally themselves with some other very large companies, it's too big a stretch. They would have to be maybe a U.S. defense prime, maybe a U.S. mezzanine supplier like RTX or GE or someone like that, or maybe all of these. But it would take an alignment of very large companies, all of which, frankly, dwarf Embraer in size to make an Embraer jet happen. The only thing Embraer would bring to the table is, hey, we're great at execution. Let us do it. Give us a lot of the money to do it.
Yeah. Aside from the budget dynamics, which I think you phrased that well in terms of bet the company moment, when you think about what they're great at and then the ability to transfer that into the Boeing and Airbus territory, is there any way to gauge whether that's a realistic aspiration, just from your sense and your opinion on this, the likelihood of success, just in terms of execution, putting budget aside?
Don't be sad, but 2 out of 3 ain't bad, as I think Meatloaf said. Execution, they'd beat them all. Cost efficiency of production, they'd beat them all. Bandwidth needed to get there, oh, Christ. I mean, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. You look at how much they've historically spent on new product development and what they need to spend to get there. It's a different company. So again, if they were allied with much bigger partners who treated them as equals, which would be necessary, it would be a fascinating possibility. But until that happens, they're not doing this alone.
Capital requirements can be a great barrier to entry still to this day.
Pretty much. And also, frankly, I think a lot of investors were expecting a harvest cycle now from an Embraer standpoint, rather than actually, we're tripling our expenditures or quadrupling our expenditures on new product development. They were expecting some returns after a period of investment.
Yeah, maybe you can tap into that a little bit. When I hear harvest cycle, what I assume is we've developed what we want to develop in terms of new offerings. That requires a lot of capital expenditures. Now we get to actually just put those into service, sell those, and it's a lot less capital intensive once you've done it, so you can go through that harvest period. Is that a fair designation? Am I missing anything obvious there?
Yeah, but with the big complication that this is a delayed harvest period, in part because of COVID and the downturn in aircraft orders and production, and in part because they were delayed a couple of years by the abortive merger with Boeing with their commercial unit. And that was an enormous distraction of production, product development, and managerial resources in general. So they're recovering from that. They're recovering from COVID. Now people are like, well, that and your big investments in the last decade, we'd like some returns now, please.
Can you talk through that failed merger? What was the origin story in terms of the desire for that to happen and then what fell through?
It depends which story you believe, but the idea was they would take their commercial unit and merge it in with Boeing. And Boeing Brazil would actually maybe even help develop a new Boeing jet using the engineering talent. And maybe there'd be cross-decking where Embraer jets were given commonality with existing Boeing jets. There were all sorts of interesting possibilities. And this would also help Embraer deal with its number one disadvantage in the world, which is a lack of supply chain muscle, inability to get its cost base down in line with Airbus and Boeing. So for them, it represented a really strong solution to their problems. Now, of course, there was also the issue of what would happen with the rest of the company. The general feeling was that business aviation would be spun off, maybe sold to Gulfstream or somebody. There'd be a fit with one or two of the other bizjet primes, and that the military would revert to what it started at in 1969, effectively a national defense champion. Remainco would be Embraer Defense, the arsenal system for Brazil. It's a fascinating set of counterfactuals, but the two sides walked away. More pointedly, Boeing walked away. There's still a bit of a legal aftermath. I don't know how that's going, but it obviously caused a great deal of confusion, distraction, and whatever else at Embraer. Now they're still comporting themselves for a very different future, a very different reality.
It begs the question, obviously, there's a bad taste in each company's mouth, I would imagine. But if you're talking about acquiring a good management team that could maybe reinvigorate your corporate culture in the right direction, it certainly seems like there might be alignment there. Is this ever something that you could see come back into the possibilities?
That's a really interesting question. I think there are some who really see some of the advantages you just mentioned. You can't rule it out, but it seems like there's a lot of bad blood under the bridge, to mix metaphors.
Some of that bad blood no longer at Boeing, but point certainly taken. And I don't think it's ever wise to bet on any type of M&A. There's way too many people and challenges to getting these things done. So
that's right.
Interesting to think about, though. Certainly interesting to think about. You've mentioned a few times Bombardier, Canadian business that is operating in a very similar way to Embraer. When you think about what they're doing and as they either pose a potential risk or whether it's a comfortable duopoly similar to how Airbus and Boeing seem to operate, how would you categorize them relative to Embraer?
Yeah, former nemesis and archenemy, and now barely any overlap, really. Bombardier did bet the company on what was the C series, and they stumbled very badly. I like to joke back in the last decade that Embraer was an amazingly managed company in an extremely poorly managed country. And Bombardier was an incredibly poorly managed company in an extremely well-managed country. It was very strange, the juxtaposition. But because of this failure, Bombardier had no choice but to sell off its entire regional aircraft division. It's now in the hands of Mitsubishi, which decided to do nothing with it. And it's sitting there. So Bombardier is the world's first, as of a couple of years ago, pure play business aviation prime, publicly traded business aviation prime. They're doing pretty darn well with it, but it's mostly stuff at the top end. You look at the bottom end of their range, Challenger 3500, there is some competition there with the Praetor series. But other than that, you had two people who used to be locked in a cage match. And they're now, oh yeah, hey, how's it going over there? Not bad. You?
Yeah, I wonder if they long for those days of rivalry. Sometimes you miss it after the fact.
I'll bet there's some nostalgia for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Just in the biz jet market, from a size perspective, how big is it relative to the regional market or even the defense market? Is it a large TAM market?
Well, it depends where you are in time in terms of cycles. It's smaller, but they're not too different. You look at the business of jetliners at its peak, where we're fast heading back to again, it's a $120 billion a year enterprise. Regionals are about $5 billion a year. And BizAv is around 22, but there are so many more players. There are basically 6, 5 plus a couple of extras. BizAv is a bigger addressable market, but I remember years ago, I asked the then head of their business jet unit in Embraer, I was like, have you thought about moving upward into the rarefied air of the larger jets? And he said, it's like a hornet's nest up there. It's hard to avoid that conclusion, I'm afraid.
Yeah, makes sense. When you think about Embraer, I think we've referenced some of the risks that could be associated with the business here, particularly if you take on a bet the company moment and trying to make that push into new territory. But are there any other things that we haven't mentioned that would stand out as risks for Embraer?
Well, there's political risk, of course. We saw that with the election. Lula's a classic non-aligned, but ultimately well-meaning politician. He's got his limits, obviously. And then there was Bolsonaro. That was another cup of tea. That was an absolute wild card geopolitically. And it could have been much worse. They had their January 6th. So that domestic political instability, coupled with a very different political direction for the country, that represents risk. I think one big area of concern is anything that leads Airbus to really double down on A220 competitiveness. So they've been working to drive down costs. But if they say, okay, this is no longer our adopted Canadian jet, we mean it. And we're going to get costs down and even take a loss just to beat up the 190, 195, that represents risk. And then finally, you can't rule out the possibility of someone saying, hey, regional aircraft are neglected in the world. We'd like to go after that segment. And I don't see it, but you can't rule it out. You add it all up, it's not a lot. And frankly, now there are a lot more opportunities. The biggest being that for the first time in 30 years, global defense spending is skyrocketing upwards and everyone is looking for industrial capacity. And while Embraer products aren't exactly right for a standoff with China or Russia, they're in the right place at the right time. So I think they can expect to see a healthier increase in defense exports.
Yeah, the picks and shovels business, which is interesting when you have all this turmoil. This has been a fascinating, wide-ranging, interesting conversation on one of the other players in this space. We've talked about Boeing before and aviation more broadly. When you just think about the lessons that you can pull away from this company that you think you could apply elsewhere, I already have a list in my head, but what stands out to you as a lesson from Embraer?
Well, first and foremost, again, that juxtaposition with Boeing and everything that's gone on, culminating in this week's events, aircraft people should run aircraft companies. It's absolutely essential. And Embraer has been super about that. Absolutely terrific. Another lesson, of course, is just be really good at your core competence. Don't try to do everything. Vertical integration is not a good idea. Recognize what your niche is. Another that I think they've been gradually learning is the importance of partnerships. And when you're a small company, you don't have to be arrogant or hubristic about partners. And it's just really good to work with other companies across borders. Most of France, amazing collection of skills and experience and products in France. They are god-awful at partnering because it's France. They do it well. They do it best. If you like a joint venture, yes, it's a Franco-French joint venture partnership between France and France. I guess you could say Brazil's the opposite.
I like that. That's a wide-ranging list of lessons as well. And I think it was good that we started out the episode with a lesson to not take away. It's the don't try this at home with this outlier story, but finished with some very applicable ones. So thank you, Richard. Appreciate you joining us and sharing the knowledge here.
It's really my pleasure, Matt. Thanks for having me on.
To find more episodes of breakdowns ranging from Costco to Visa to Moderna, or to sign up for our weekly summary, check out joincolossus.com. That's JOINCOLOSSUS.com.
A quick note before you go. If you are a company hiring or a candidate looking for your next opportunity, make sure to check out joincolossus.com/recruiting. We launched our recruiting efforts at the end of last year. We started working with firms that were interested in tapping into our audience. And after seeing some early success, we want to open this up to additional firms and to candidates who are proactively looking for their next opportunity. So we are mostly revolving around the investment world and the tech industry. But again, make sure to check out joincolossus.com/recruiting for more information.